Today we're going to start learning the quadratic formula. Before we get into the quadratic formula right here, let's go ahead and review some different forms of quadratics we've already gone through. First and most important, we have standard form of a quadratic. ax squared plus bx plus c. And if you notice, I have highlighted A, B, and C in different colors. I'm going to try to keep those same three colors throughout this entire video series so we can identify this A, B, and C coefficient and how we use them in different places. Then let's look at vertex form. Vertex form, it actually shares that A, then we have the B coefficient here, the x minus h was the x value for the vertex, and then the plus k at the end was my y value for my vertex. There's that A. What's going to be very important later is to do quadratic formula, we have to have standard form. Now for the quadratic formula. You don't really have to memorize this, and of course if you forget it, you can just Google quadratic formula and it will pop up all over the place. It's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all that's over 2a. Now there's two parts to the quadratic formula. One that might be familiar, one part that might be familiar, and the other part we're going to talk about in more detail today. So if we look at this negative b over 2a, it's the same as our axis of symmetry. There's the negative b over 2a. So if we take away this plus or minus part, that is our axis of symmetry. We should be familiar with that and how to plug those numbers in. Then we have this yellow highlighted part that's inside of my square root symbol. That's called the discriminant. That's another important piece that we're going to talk about in a lot of detail today. The other thing I want to touch base on is this plus or minus. For the first problem or two, I'm going to keep this plus or minus in this light blue and light pink color. Plus or minus simply means I have it twice. I want the plus version of it or the negative version. So if I say plus or minus 3, what I mean is plus 3 or minus 3. I need to have both. For example, if I say 5 plus or minus 3, I have 5 plus 3. And if I say 5 plus 3, that's going to give me 8. And then if I say 5 minus 3, that's going to be 2. So when I answer what is 5 plus 3, 5 plus or minus 3, that's going to be 8, or that's going to be 2. So I have to have both of those. If I say 5 plus or minus 3, I need to have both of those. Now we're going to look at setting up that quadratic formula. So for our quadratic formula setup, we're going to need standard form. The standard form equation needs to be set equal to 0 because we're solving for those intersection points. So here we have an example. We're going to plug this in best we can. X squared minus 16x minus 6 equal to 0. What I have done is I have outlined the quadratic formula for us. If you need the letters, again, it's up here. Feel free to copy it down and look it up online or on the board. Now we're going to list all of our values. We need A, B, and C. And I have these color coded. I'm going to keep these color coded so it's easier to see. So the first one we need is A. What is A equal to? Well, A, if I look at standard form, right here, is a leading coefficient when it's in standard form. There's no leading coefficient. I see my term, but there's nothing in front of it. What that means is we have a 1 there. So my leading coefficient is a 1. So what I want to do now is look at B. B is the coefficient in front of the x. So my b value is equal to negative 16. You're including the sign in front of it. Whatever sign's in front of it, you keep. If it was plus 16, it would be positive 16. This is negative 16, so we're going to say that is negative 16. And the last one, the c value at the end, c is equal to negative 6. And of course, this has to equal 0. If it does not equal 0, this does not work and you're not doing anything productive. Once I've identified a, b, and c with a standard form equation set equal to 0, I outline my quadratic formula. Here's my quadratic formula. I've taken out the a's, the b's, and the c, and I've put parentheses. Again, I've tried to color match this best I can. There's a plus or minus in there. And I have that highlighted like we talked about earlier. Let's go ahead and start filling out. Once you have your parentheses in there, and I want you to get in the habit of putting parentheses first and filling in later. It really helps us whenever we have several negatives in our quadratic equation. So let's go through and plug in the a's. A is 1, so I can put 1 in here and 1 in there. Let's go ahead and look at the b's. B is negative 16. So in the parentheses, negative 16 there, negative 16 there. Let's go ahead, do the c. C is negative 6. Now I have a filled out quadratic formula. And the next thing we need to do is to simplify it. I usually try to simplify in 2 steps. First thing I want to do is just take each of these little pieces. I like to look at 3 different pieces of it, 3 different sections. First section we can look at is whatever's in front of the plus or minus. So what's in front of the plus or minus? We have negative 16. This is one of those places that we can get really confused if we do not use parentheses. So that is a positive 16 or just 16. On multiple choice tests, they like to give you everything correct, but leave a negative here, which would cancel out because we have both of these. So be aware of that. Then we have negative 16 squared. We can go ahead and use our calculator for that. We want to do negative 16 squared. Go ahead and plug in the calculator, and we get 256. So I'm going to put 256 right here. And then I'm going to say minus, and then I have, that's a the way I can put this in the calculator, I see negative 4. So I'm going to include whatever this coefficient is. And in this case, for this discriminant in here, it's always going to be a negative 4. And then I'm going to multiply it by a 1, and then multiply it by a negative 6. As you see, this is exactly what's in there. Negative 4, parentheses 1, parentheses negative 6. It's exactly like this. Press enter. That piece in there is 24. And then the bottom, 2 times 1, is simply 2. The last piece to simplify this is going to be 16, and then we have 256 minus 24, 232, and at the bottom we have a 2. To me, that is the basic part of simplifying it. From this point, you might try to simplify the radical. It might be a perfect square. It might be an imaginary number, which we'll talk about eventually. But this is the first place this is simplified. From here, we can probably simplify it some more. But at the very least, we need to be able to get here for right now. We have the part in front of the plus or minus. We have the part under the radical, which is called the discriminant. And then we have the denominator, the fraction. The plus or minus, the reason we have a plus or minus relates to what we talked about yesterday with square roots. A square root typically has a positive and a negative value. So square root of 9 could be positive or negative 3. That's why we have a plus or minus here. That's why we end up with 2 answers, because it's a plus and a minus.